Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to these wonderful conversations we're having here at this conference. This morning, Cathy Caruth is going to open our day's proceedings with a talk on death and life at the site of address. Cathy Caruth is the preeminent scholar on trauma. So many of us have referred to her work, some of our work. We refer to her as the foundational text of her work, such as the books Unclaimed Experience, Trauma, Narrative, and History. That, for us, is a very central book for many of us. We are talking with colleagues at the back, Leslie Swartz, Julie Classens, from different disciplines. This is what her work is helping us with, is finding a language to speak about trauma across disciplines. And this book especially has been a very central text for many of us, Unclaimed Experience. She is the Frank H.T. Rhodes Professor of Humane Letters in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Cornell University. Her focus is on languages of trauma and testimony, on literary theory, and on contemporary discourses concerning the annihilation and survival of language. Cathy's most recent books are Literature in the Ashes of History and Listening to Trauma, Conversations with Leaders in the Theory and Treatment of Catastrophic Experiences. She's also done interviews and photography, a book on interviews and photography. So this is a field you can see is quite diverse. It's very interdisciplinary, but I have to mention also a book that was not in her bio, which is one of her earlier texts, Trauma, Explorations in Memory. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Cathy Caruth.
Thank you, Pumla, so much, and thank you for bringing me to this wonderful event. It's been a very remarkable and impactful experience for me. I'd also like to express my gratitude to Eugene Kletta, the Deputy Rector of Stellenbosch, to Emery Kalema, Landy Meering, who have been so wonderful in organizing and helping support us. Also to Teresa Edelman and the other organizers, to Stellenbosch University and the Institute for Historical Memory and Transformation. Thank you so much. I have 3 epigraphs today. The first is from Françoise Devoine and Jean-Marc Scaudière. They're 2 French psychoanalysts. They're clinicians who work with psychosis, which they see as always linked to historical trauma, at least in their experience. They say in an interview that I conducted with them some years ago, when it's madness, the track of the trauma is lost. You just have a witness of what you do not know. Perhaps a lot of time has passed, or the trauma has been so wiped out, as in the mass graves, where there is grass and they say, nothing happened, it's all fantasy. And so madness happens when the tracks are lost. The second quotation is from an email that Pumla sent me recently in some of the unsettling period right before the conference. She said, "We have invited the shadow to this conference, and it is hovering over us." And the third quotation is from a letter that was sent to Bishop Tutu from a listener to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and this person wrote a poem, and here is some of the poem. "The world is wept. Blood and pain seep into our listening. into our wounded souls. So we have heard during the past few days from the children of murdered parents who have spoken of the importance of dialogue in dealing with their father's murders and with their mother's different relations to those deaths. Pumla's opening remarks at the conference also emphasized the importance of dialogue in accessing the impact of reconciliation processes in South Africa, as they have been experienced by the current generation, and perhaps of furthering those processes. My talk today will approach the question of dialogue from a specific angle through the problem of address, and specifically the difficulty and possibility of creating a true address in the context of trauma. This question of address, I believe, lies at the very center of the experience of historical trauma, which has been defined by Shoshana Fellman and Dory Laub, the literary critic and psychoanalyst survivor, as, quote, a collapse of witnessing, end quote, a circumstance of having, quote, no one to whom one could say thou, end quote. I will turn today to the work of Françoise Devoine, a French psychoanalyst who, with her late husband, Jean-Max Gaudier, have spent many years working clinically with the treatment of psychosis, or as they call it, madness, la folie, which they describe in their book, History Beyond Trauma, as, quote, research into uninscribed histories, end quote. That's what madness is for them. At the heart of madness is the attempted witness to a break in the social link, the extreme violence and perverse use of power that produce a society constituted by denial and a history that is marked by its loss of any addressee. The challenge of listening to madness, and more generally, to the survivors of extreme trauma, is not simply to find a story that has not been told, but, quote, to respond to them from the place where there is no other responding, to find the place of otherness to which they can speak, end quote. When the guarantees of speech are closed, they ask, how construct an other to whom to speak? How allow trauma, in other words, which emerges in madness, quote, to constitute an addressee for its discourse, end quote. In the story I will tell today, from the 2007 essay, The Characters of Madness in the Speaking Cure, Devoine shows us one way in which an uninscribed history can begin to become inscribed in a clinical encounter with madness. This happens through a process in which the unaddressable speech of this history comes in onto the analytic stage, and a new kind of address is ultimately created. While Devoine's story focuses on two specific individuals, Devoine herself and a mad woman who came to her from a mental hospital, the details that emerge through the transference and countertransference enactments, quote, do not in fact belong to either patient or analyst, end quote. They are part of a larger history lived by their mothers, and they involve the meeting of two incompatible pasts, of a Jewish woman who was deported and died, and of a non-Jewish resistance fighter who was arrested but survived. Pasts that are joined and disjoined in the collective social experience of France during World War II. In a broader sense, then, the clinical encounter in Devoine's story stages a process that is not limited strictly to psychoanalytic work. For as she says, quote, this is nothing new and has been practiced since the beginnings of theater, especially in animistic societies. Yet it is not easy to do or talk about. It is implicated in the calamities of the social link, and endeavors to incorporate into language that which could not be written down in history, past evils that were impossible to be spoken of again, end quote. In her story, at the very site in which the I and thou of any address is lost, when the history that surfaces seems to eliminate any possibility of addressor and addressee, the two people coming together adopt a set of masks or characters who step onto the stage to enable the inscription of this unarticulated history and to create a new relation across radically different pasts. So section 1. In telling the story of the analysis then, Devuan will turn to the language of theater, and specifically of the 17th century No theater of Japan. The encounter of patient and analyst, as Devuan relates it, does not strictly take place between two people, at least at first, but between the characters of madness that emerge on the cramped and narrow stage that Devuan's office has become. Quote, imagine that this minute stage is my consulting room, end quote, she tells us. On this stage come two actors, as from the No theater, the Waki, who is a wandering pilgrim who meets various people in his travels. He is played by the analyst. The Waki meets the Shite, a simple peasant or gardener, and proceeds to ask about the whereabouts of both of them. Then the Waki goes to sleep in a corner of the stage, and the Shite appears, quote, coming from the bridge linking us to the land of the dead, end quote. He is now anachronistic, wearing the famous wooden white mask and dressed in the past splendor of the traditional clothes he was wearing at the time of his death. And he proceeds to sing and dance the moment of his death, quote, so that everyone, starting with the Waki, and as a consequence, all who are watching him, hear the truth about the details that were cut out from the official story, end quote. I too am dreaming, Devuan says, and she proceeds to tell the analysis as a play in 3 acts, a No theater in which her own dream becomes a central hinge that turns between the stories of patient and analyst, which reverberate unconsciously, and the stories of their mothers. In this passage between stories, the apparent symmetry, the mirror between the mad woman who speaks and the one who listens, is shattered, opening the way for true listening to begin, that is, for the conditions of address to be established. 2. In Act 1, thus, quote, a very pale woman with an expressionless face, end quote, arrives in Devuan's office saying that she had escaped from the hospital in which she had been interned for the third time, and in which she had found herself, she said, among the living dead. Falling insensitive each time she finishes speaking, she remarks at the end of the session that she is worried about her children's future. Devuan, not knowing how to respond to this affectless woman, suddenly hears herself say in a peremptory manner, quote, it is the resistance that is driving you crazy, end quote. I had picked up the signifier resistance in the course of the story, Devuan tells us. Electrical resistance, resistance to psychoanalysis, resistance to fatigue, etc. Annoyed at herself that she had used the word crazy, Devuan does not expect to see the woman again, who nonetheless shows up the next week with rosy cheeks, checked out of the hospital with the news of a surprising story. Quote, she then told me that her mother had been deported because of her part in the French resistance, and that she had been told of her death with the words, your mother will not be coming back. Her father had remarried a woman whose name meant she lives, and she was convinced her mother would return. Quote, she had rapidly understood everything. The hospital was a place she searched for her mother among the living dead, unquote. In Act 2, a dream Devuan has barely noticed initiates a period in which this happy story of maternal heroism and the daughter's self-understanding fall apart. When Devuan says, quote, a part of this story, the part that remained foreclosed, was to escape on the public scene and make me come off the hinges of my own story and forego my neutrality. This is her dream. So Devon tells her dream here. I could see my son, who was then a baby, lying drowned in the basin of a fountain that was inside a house. I can still remember the horror that this vision inspired in me. I take him in my arms to give him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and I see the color and life coming back into his cheeks with a strange brightness that I had experienced during the first session. The dream seemed to be quite clear, only the basin seemed out of place, a fountain basin inside a house, end quote. Devon says she does not understand the dream during the analysis, but only later, when that unusual detail of the fountain basin inside a house referred me back to my own story. She then turns to her audience. Again, this is Devon. At this point, I must tell you a secret, and this is a true story. I was in my mother's pelvic basin when she was arrested by the Germans while carrying letters across the demarcation line for the resistance. We therefore both spent her pregnancy in prison, in an overcrowded cell with the daily threat of execution, as each night one of the prison cells was designated to be a hostage if the resistance were to take any action. In the morning after the torture sessions, we used to hear the firing squad. My mother was not Jewish and barely managed to escape. I was born soon afterwards, but I know little more as she decided never to speak of the experience and to dye her hair, which, like her skin, was from then on to remain completely white due to a sudden depigmentation. This unlikely baby hovering on the brink of life and death was the double that enabled me, in the words of Artaud, quote, to transgress the usual limits of our exchanges, end quote. It is the double emerging through her dream, Devon suggests, that, quote, evokes the character of madness, end quote. In Act 3, a certain torpor sets into the analysis when she says time slowed down and the progress made during the analysis seemed to fade away. We found ourselves, Devon says, in a position where a text no longer existed. The patient disappears from the analysis and the woman disappears back into the hospital. It is at this point, however, that madness, quote, entered the scene via the bridge of the in-between and a session of cruelty began, end quote. And here is the session of cruelty in her words. The character who then came in was a very old Jewish woman full of rage. Accompanying her was an atmosphere of terror. This character was more like a puppet than a character seen in its complexity, whom I immediately identified as her mother who had returned from Dachau. The woman who was entering the cramped space of my consulting room was appearing at the very moment she had been assassinated, a moment immobilized in time and from when she cursed me. I was Hitler, Mengele. I had tortured her, experimented on her. The only point of this analysis had been to savor the suffering that should never have been aroused, unquote. This is a theater of cruelty, Devon says, that shocks and nearly silences her and threatens to plunge the woman who appears on the stage of her office back into her hospitalized entrapment. Yet in the midst of this violence, Devon says, quote, while I was endeavoring to survive the wholesale massacre, I think I told her that I had no doubt been drawn at her request into an adventure that was not without danger, but that I was there beneath these carnival masks of Hitler and Mengele, so that she, or rather the mother through her, could emerge from her unsullied role of the heroine and express her hatred at having been betrayed, unquote. After this, the patient comes back no longer as the mad character. She now believes her mother was deported for being Jewish and takes a train to Germany to attend a trial against a Nazi, returning with a document that shows her mother's name on one of the convoys sent for extinction. She says her mother has now found a burial place and never returns to the analysis. 4. What does this drama mean for understanding how an untold history emerges in a listening encounter? Or as Devon asks, quote, whom is madness speaking to, if not to us? But who then is the us? Is it the analyst, the psychiatrist, or society in general, as she has a tendency to call the entire world to witness her words, unquote. Who indeed, I would ask, speaks, and who listens from the site of trauma? In the drama that is performed in DeWan's office, neither patient nor analyst entirely knows the answer to this question when their encounter begins. Indeed, in the drama of the transferential encounter, not only the patient and analyst, but also the living and the dead change places, as the drama of the living daughters acts out the interments and death of their speechless mothers. They will ultimately return as daughters who can address each other from distinct sites across these circulating stories, but only after a moment of near annihilation, in which speech is on the verge of, quote, losing its rights, unquote. The two women then begin to tell their stories through each other's stories, but they will also pass through a moment in which their stories no longer address each other. The passage between stories and its disruption both take place through the dream, a kind of fictional and non-fictional site within the analytic listener that allows the stories of patient and analyst to come into contact and for the encounter between the two women to give birth to an untold story. This dream, DeWan's dream of resuscitating a dead baby, can be seen to serve as a hinge between the analyst's and patient's stories, as well as a crossing point in which the living and the dead are inextricably entangled. This is first of all exemplified by the fact that the center point of the analysis is not the patient's dream, but DeWan's own, displacing the center of the drama from the patient's unconscious, which is the usual focus of analytic work, to that of the analyst. Yet DeWan's dream, which she associates with the coming to life of her own double, the infant imprisoned within her mother in the German cell, in fact provides the catalyst for the resuscitation of the patient's mother, whose story does not belong moreover to either the patient or the analyst's unconscious, but rather constitutes the very unconsciousness of a history that has not yet been possessed. 5. This movement among stories, in fact, establishes the drama of the analysis, one in which the apparent smoothness of exchange is replaced by a peculiar rupture. It is a shift from a kind of dialogue, perhaps, or pseudo-dialogue, albeit an unconscious one, to a relation that is established around what the two mothers' stories can never simply have in common. It is a shift as well between a back and forth of speech, which seems to be an address between one woman and another, to a relation structured around an apparent annihilation of address after the entrance of a violent and mad rage upon the scene threatens to destroy once again the social link and to deny any possibility of speaking and of listening. Let us trace briefly this movement for a moment, since it can help us understand the process of this encounter and perhaps others that it may resonate with. The first analytic intervention by the analyst, it is the resistance that is driving you insane, turns out ultimately, as we learn through the dream, not to signify the patient's story of her mother's arrest and execution for being in the French resistance, but the analyst's story of her mother's arrest and survival. Indeed, the patient's story of the dead mother's resistance, the hero story, was in fact a kind of fiction, though it brought the analyst back to her own mother's reality. What allows the patient to speak about her own dead mother is DeWan's unconscious relation to the signifier resistance, which sets up what seems to be a dialogue between the worlds of the conscious and the unconscious, and between the stories of analyst and patient. Yet when DeWan speaks from within the story of her own infancy, when she speaks with a voice of the double she has identified as the strange figure of the baby in the basin, she ultimately enables not her own but the patient's mother's story to escape its silence and the uninscribed event of her annihilation to escape into view on the stage. The truth of the patient's mother's story, that she was not a resistance hero, that she was deported and murdered simply because she was Jew, breaks into the analysis in a performance that is not exactly a storytelling, but rather an enactment that threatens to annihilate all further speech. In this new meeting of stories, at the crossroads of the dream, there is no longer a smooth movement along a chain of signifiers operating around a single key, the word signifier, the word resistance, but rather an arrest of movement that is also the site of an impossible doubling. As Jean-Max Gaudillère has said, to try to get to a trauma in analysis through the association of signifiers always leads to an impasse, because it is precisely where signification breaks down that the dramatic history begins. In this story, the history emerges then when the arrest of the patient's mother, this history emerges when, rather than the arrest of the patient's mother crossing over with the arrest of the analyst's mother, we see the analyst's mother's internment and survival doubled and violently interrupted by the patient's mother's internment and death. At the point of arrest, the mother's stories come into contact, not around the apparent signifying centers that seem to mirror each other, but rather around the break-in or arrest of signification. This rupture juxtaposes the unthinkable and ultimately meaninglessness of the one who died because she was a Jew with the one who apparently survived because she was not. This interruption, moreover, takes the form of a kind of annihilation of address, which arises when the mad mother appears in the office to accuse the character of the analyst of being her torturer. And she says, again, I was Hitler, Mengele, I had tortured her, experimented on her. The only point of this analysis had been to savor the suffering that should never have been aroused. In the accusation emerging through the words of a murdered and raging mother, all listening is annihilated as the analyst is turned into the Nazi who denied interlocution and exchange, and the patient is subsumed by the maternal character who screams her own murder. Quote, here she was no longer addressing the other of the symbolic order, the great other often referred to by Lacan, but the real other, the ruthless, deceiving other that cannot ground any law, end quote. In other words, what looks like an address, you did this, you did not, is actually the annihilation of address. And that annihilation of address in the interlocution actually reenacts what the language of the Nazi did. Devoine immediately identifies this mad person as the mother who had returned from Dachau, evoking an event, quote, beyond the boundaries of that which is human, end quote, which includes precisely annihilating both addresser and addressee. What is enacted in it is indeed not so much the actual murder of the mother as the elimination of the very conditions of testimony, the addressor, the addressee, and the language of interlocution that can serve as its witness. This elimination of the conditions of address is the heart of this traumatic history. 6. Yet this collapse of witness that sits at the intersection between the mother's two stories also serves in Devoine's retelling as the very beginning of an opening between the daughters of a new form of dress. What Devoine does at this moment, I believe, can teach us something about the conditions of listening from within trauma. Indeed, as the patient's mother returns through the mad daughter's ravings to accuse the analyst of causing her suffering, the analyst responds not to the mother, but to the daughter, and responds precisely around the problem of listening. And I'll quote it again. As I was attempting to survive the wholesale massacre, I think I told her that I had no doubt been drawn at her request into an adventure that was not without danger, but that I was there disguised with these carnival masks of Hitler and Mengele, so that she, or rather her mother through her, could emerge from her unsullied role of the heroine and express her hatred at having been betrayed, unquote. Naming her role in the drama of the dead mother, the analyst also enacts a survival that takes place specifically as an address to the living daughter. She hears the annihilating rage of the mother, that is, as a summons from the daughter, to which she as a daughter can also respond. This capacity to hear or to receive or even create an address at a point that seems impossible, to listen, comes, we might say, from the double, from the analyst's untold story of her infancy. So she's not just listening as herself, she's listening as her double. The infant in the dream, the infant Devoine in the womb, struggling to survive her mother's interment, can hear the address of the daughter, the patient before her, who has been dispossessed by her mother's story. This address between the two is carried in part, I believe, by what the philosopher Jean-François Lyotard called the inarticulate affect of infancy that speaks also in trauma and emerges here in the analyst's words, right at the place that no articulation seems possible. With your consent, Devoine writes, I will ask you to imagine that the character of madness would be unable to speak to us unless it was invoked by another character, summoned to the position held by the analyst, a sort of double, but one that is totally different. Not her alter ego, because in that position there is neither an ego nor an alter. I have no self, the psychiatric patient often laments. Hospitalized patients concentrate on an invisible target, searching for the character who will play opposite them. An enigmatic double is therefore required, not based on any similitude, nor any sort of empathy or harmony, simply because in this context, nothing really looks like anything anymore, and the mirror image is shattered, no longer exists. This address is also the harbinger within the analyst's untold history of a future birth, the birth of a new subject and the birth of a new language. Devoine says, citing the playwright Artaud, that it is, quote, the necessity of speech rather than of ready-made speech, poetically retracing the steps that resulted in the birth of language, end quote. In the story she recounts, Devoine tells us, quote, the character of madness takes off the masks, including the mask of the psychoanalyst, end quote. It is precisely where these characters lose their faces that they can construct a new kind of language and a new human encounter. 7. This is not to say that at the end of the analytic drama, the work of history telling is simply completed. For there are two characters of madness in Devoine's story, whom she also names, drawing on Erasmus's work, as Folly, from the book Praise of Folly. The one who arrives at the beginning of her essay, as does the patient, and says, it is I, Folly, who speaks. And the analyst and author, Françoise Devoine, who says she will take refuge behind Folly's words and reminds us at the beginning of her essay, quote, if you find my discourse too petulant or loquacious, remember that I am Folly and that I spoke as a woman, unquote. The words of Folly coming onto the stage are not simply the words of the patient then, but also the words of the analyst, who cannot receive or speak about Folly except through Folly's own language, and who in turn will summon us to listen to what remains mute in this written story. The process of witnessing between these two people, that is constituted as a summons for others to begin to respond. Just as perhaps the dialogues we've been hearing about here in this remarkable conference between children and their parents' murderers, or between mothers and children affected by a father's and husband's deaths, have come as a summons to question and reconstitute ourselves in response to what is not simply assimilable in these stories. Likewise, when Folly speaks in Devoine's essay, not in the session, but in her own writing, in Devoin's own writing. She turns to the reader, and she does so most strikingly, moreover, at the point of the dream, the revelation of the secret of the author's own interment in her mother's belly while her mother was interned in a German prison. Again, quote, "At this point, I must tell you a secret. I was in my mother's pelvic basin when she was arrested by the Germans while carrying letters across the demarcation line for the resistance," end quote. The figure of imprisonment here can be said to double upon itself. It is not only the internment of the infant with the mother in the prison, but also the internment of the infant in the mother's womb, a prison of its own that silently doubles but never quite coincides with the stories of death and survival in the clinical drama. Indeed, the peculiar we that governs the story of the unborn infant and mother seems to signal the nature of an affect that Lyotard links both to trauma and to infancy, what he calls the phrase affect that has no addressor nor addressee, because it is precisely prior to these categories, or in trauma, has been returned to infancy by an event. Quote, "In the morning," Devoin tells us, "after the torture sessions, we used to hear the firing squad," unquote. This we cannot be taken literally as a shared experience, but must be read as a kind of figure for a muteness within Devoin's own story that speaks through the mask of the child in the womb. The story of this speechlessness indeed engulfs the very framework, the drama that frames this text, for we cannot read of the cramped and narrow office that Devoin associates with the stage of the no drama without also thinking of the cramped and narrow space of that wordless site of the womb imprisoned within the prison. Françoise's mother, as she tells us elsewhere, she tells us here and she tells us elsewhere, turned white after this experience. And we also know, and this is from elsewhere, that her mother was no longer able to take care of her child after that experience. The figure of the double imprisonment cannot be translated from one story or another, and leaves a bit of non-signification at the heart of the drama's many exchanges. It is from this speechless figure of the infant that another mute and uninscribed history attempts to address us from Devoin's text. 8. A lot could be said here about the traces of this story, and I won't say all of it, in the language of Folly that she pulls from Erasmus's Praise of Folly, which speaks through her own use of folie, or madness, and whose Latin origins speak only mutely through the English translation. So in English, it's folly is more like being foolish, and in French, it has a different sense. This hidden movement between languages echoes also the conception of the Praise of Folly, which was carried across the Alps, much as the letters that Devoin's mother carried for the resistance passed across the Alps between France and Switzerland, where she was arrested at the pass. What is arrested in this movement between languages? How does folly or madness or trauma pass over and yet not pass over across cultures and linguistic frameworks? Is trauma ever spoken in a single language? And if not, in what language does one listen or constitute oneself as its addressee? This is a question that is also played out in Devoin's essay as the problem of the institution of psychoanalysis itself, as the story passes from the centrality of signifiers in the first act, the sort of Lacanian moment, Freudian Lacanian moment, through the crossroads of the dream that is no longer an Oedipal, but a traumatic crossroads, to the encounter with madness that explodes the analytic frame. The passage through these stages is perhaps also the story of psychoanalysis as it comes to encounter, in the madness of others, a traumatic past within its own institution, both the threat to its existence by and its own negotiations with Nazism that it has not yet adequately begun to confront. The listening through unconscious and untold stories includes ultimately the institutional silences informing and reverberating in any analytic encounter, and the need to inscribe those histories as well in any new forms of address that emerge on their site. Closing. In the story I have just told, two women of a second generation, a patient and an analyst, come to address each other through the unarticulated paths of their mothers, and in so doing, allow the enactment and inscription of a larger, non-assimilated history. This takes place as an encounter that is mediated by the dream, which is also the site of masks, of characters on the stage, and by the emergence of the double, the inarticulate story within one character that comes to wait for and draw out the loud and angry, speechless violence of the other. What kind of recognition occurs, if it does, through this process at the site of the dream, with the donning of masks and through the emergence of the double? What kind of address can we call this? And is it necessary for reconciliation and forgiveness? Or is it rather a process of reconciliation already taking place prior to the constitution of any address? And who is formed and who speaks from this new place? Devuan turns to another culture to begin to try to answer that question at the end of her own story, where she illustrates the possibility of a social link emerging from trauma, but forming a society constituted not by the annihilation, but by the transmission of listening. And I close with her quotation. The Athabascan Indians of Canada sent children into the bush as part of a ritual to seek a vision. And on their return, this vision can be interpreted only on the basis of a dream that one of the elders has had in relation to the child in question. It is only in this way, at the crossroad of dreams, that the story can actually become real in the theater of the child's narrative. From then on, the secrets and symptoms of childhood, which apparently belong to not to only one person, but which in fact have a bearing on the ruptures in the social link, will be told to an even larger audience through the dreams of the elders, until they slowly become the property of the entire community in the form of myths. This is what they call the path of life, the path of telling secrets. Thank you.